So welcome to the third workshop of the Workshop Wednesday series with Women's Studies Online. We're at the halfway point, sort of. I would, as always, like to begin by thanking Cherry Smiley, who's the mastermind behind Women's Studies Online. And as always, I'm extremely thankful to have been given the space to be able to talk about the history of second wave feminist print culture. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bec Wonders, and I'm currently a PhD student at the Glasgow School of Art in the dealing with the history of the women's liberation movement in Britain, the publishing arm of the movement, feminist periodicals, and the mediation of conflict through print. I co-founded the Vancouver Women's Library in 2017, and I'm a current member of Radical Girls. I've been starting off each workshop by honoring my grandmother, Lillian Wonders. You can see here in her garage printing press, Wonders Printing. She taught me a lot about letterpress printing and even more about the love for publishing. So today's workshop is on the topic of feminist conflict, feminist friendship, the mediation of disagreement through second wave periodicals, and the importance of multiplicity and plurality of feminist theory. All of the slides, resources, and recordings of today will be made available to you after the workshop. And as I noted during the previous workshops, this is a telling of a history, not of history. So today's workshop is not meant to be comprehensive. Rather, it is a selective telling through my own lens of what I think are interesting examples of feminist conflict and the mediation of differences that can potentially enrich contemporary discussions of similar issues, and also create intergenerational links of, between second wave feminist activism and similar concerns that are at the forefront of young women's minds today. In this sense, I hope to provoke a sense of continuity between waves rather than understanding ourselves today as separated from previous feminist efforts. With all these workshops, I hope to show that the feminist archive, feminist printed material, and feminist publishing ventures all make up a treasure trove of information on which to base inquiries into our histories. So today there are three ways I will approach the issue of feminist conflict. The first is approaching the issue in general and outlining some principles of productive feminist struggle, as well as the difficulties underlying feminist sisterhood. The second avenue will be to look at specific examples of how conflict has been mediated through the women-controlled communications infrastructure of second wave periodicals. And the third area of concern will be unpacking the potential and understanding historical feminist conflict, not as necessarily a destructive force, but a reality which allowed for the multiplicity of radical theories and strategies to emerge, and in doing so can unsettle any simplistic caricatures we might have of second wave feminism. All these three areas combined, I hope to show today, can lead to strengthened feminist principles, unity across difference, and the ongoing development of new parallel ideas and practices. I've used the following key texts today to frame today's workshop on feminist conflict and second wave periodical mediation. They're rich with information and scholarly analysis, so I suggest to anyone who'd like to dig deeper to begin with one of these books or articles. So first, let's try and make sense of feminist conflict in general. The context for this discussion is specifically conflicts that emerge within a group that by and large agrees on political ideology. So in other words, I'm not talking about conflict between feminists and anti-feminists, but rather conflict that is internal to a unified movement. Sometimes it's labeled as infighting, but today I hope to complicate our understanding of conflict in order to approach it as something that is not necessarily inherently negative or worth avoiding. One of the most fundamental texts that deals with political criticism is Gracie Lyon's 1976 Constructive Criticism. It was a small bestseller aimed at providing tools for honest and productive disagreement based on the premise that criticism is necessary for any political movement to enact fundamental change. I've never really come across anything similar to this handbook because it's specifically framed within the context of struggle internal to political organizing. I expect that some of you will already be very familiar with this text, so do bear with me as I briefly summarize her approach. And by no means do I mean to argue that these guidelines should be adapted or accepted uncritically, but I thought it would make a good starting point in trying to understand the various attempts at making sense of internal political struggle. So to begin with, Lyons differentiates constructive criticism from the more conventional therapy approaches, which in conventional therapy, the purpose is to increase the well-being of each individual. Whereas in contrast, she says about constructive criticism that we decide to do criticism not because it is best or most comfortable for us as individuals or as small groups, but because we think it will advance the whole group, the whole organization, the whole working class, ourselves included. She outlines how struggle within a group can be a contradicting experience. She says unity and struggle exist in a dialectical relationship. I only bother to struggle for unity with an organization or an individual when my political analysis tells me that we have some initial basis for coming together. But unless we develop and strengthen our unity by struggling through our disagreements and doubts and constantly reevaluate that unity as conditions change, then we quickly find that it is too superficial to allow us to function together when the chips are down. Moreover, in order for constructive criticism to take place, it's necessary to first have defined clear areas or principles of agreement. Having a clear basis of unity is very important for any relationship or organization because it provides the reference point for deciding when or what to criticize. She also addresses two common mistakes that are made in seeking a productive understanding of unity and struggle. The first mistake is to emphasize unity at all costs. People who fall into this position fail to make a correct distinction between allies and enemies or between working class and ruling class ideology. As a result, they seek to smooth over differences. They think that any struggle is bad instead of seeing the difference between principled struggle, which is necessary to advance the movement, and dogmatic factionalism. This position often springs from the fear that someone might feel bad if a struggle goes on, or from an opportunist desire to maintain a vague, unprincipled alliance. In either case, the fear of struggle usually boils down to the fear that things will be messy for me if the struggle gets hot. This kind of liberalism arises from narrow self-interest, from thinking about what is good for oneself or a small group, and not about what is good for the whole movement. The second mistake, on the other hand, is to emphasize struggle at all costs. Some people struggle for unity based on absolute unanimity, struggle with that word all the time, unanimity, because they see anything less as a form of unprincipled compromise. These dogmatists generally define unity as the identical interpretation of the revolutionary classics, so they often spend most of their time dueling with quotations and seldom venture into the messy real world. Rather than pursuing the dialectical progression of unity, struggle, transformation, they proceed from unity to splinter group to fizzle. In other words, she's referring to what we might call armchair activism, so the constant kind of theoretical critique of the movement ideology without engaging in community relations or boots on the ground organizing. She goes on to outline the underpinning attitude that she thinks political groups should have towards criticism, saying that because oppressed people share a fundamental common interest in socialist revolution, our conflicts should not be a clash of one personal interest against another, but a cooperative effort to discover the revolution that will advance the whole. And you could replace socialist revolution here with women's liberation, for example. So here she's reframing conflict as something that should invoke interest from all members, not to avenge one particular person, but actually to grow and sustain the group as a whole. Well-expressed criticism can lead to clarifying ideas and drawing out political issues versus obscuring the underlying issues in a fog of personalization and defensiveness. Lyons outlines 8 guidelines in total. Note that she starts with 0, so it's a bit confusing. The guidelines are divided into how to do criticism and how to receive criticism. I'm going to go through these quite quickly, but it's worth going back to her original text because she includes several examples and exercises in more detail. Guideline 0 is titled Getting Your Head Together, or the Importance of Having Good Intentions. This is labeled as 0 instead of 1 because it involves checking your thoughts way in advance of engaging in any criticism by asking yourself this question. Is my intention to protect and educate this person or organization, to strengthen them for the class struggle? Or is my intention to punish and coerce? Lyons emphasizes that without a sincere commitment to the strengthening of the relationship or group, any form of criticism simply won't work. So the next guideline, guideline 1, is titled Being Concrete, and it involves separating subjective opinions from objective facts. So in other words, I want to distinguish my inferences about people from the actions I saw that led me to my conclusion. So instead of saying that Kyla is an irresponsible person, I would say that Kyla showed up for the meeting 20 minutes late. Giving distinct observations is more likely to convey useful information to the person or group you're criticizing and less likely to lead to unnecessary confusion and misunderstanding. She also dissuades us from making abstract judgments like Helen is power hungry. As the more I label people with abstract judgments, the more I tend to think of them as being incapable of change. Abstract character judgments also blind me to the ways that problems are rooted in systems of interaction rather than in one person's character seen in isolation. At the same time, we should not hesitate to call a leaflet racist if it's racist, or calling something wrong if it's wrong. The point is to ground these opinions in concrete observations. Guideline 2 is labeled Describing Feelings and encourages the disclosure of one's own feelings before the criticism is shared, which helps me get a handle on my feelings so that they don't go underground, outside my conscious control, where they could burst out in destructive ways. Describing feelings also encourages me to take responsibility for my own end of the contradiction, and thus avoid laying the blame entirely on the other person. Notice that saying things like, I feel condescended to, or I feel judged, is actually conveying what you think, not what you feel. If I think you're judging me, I might feel various ways, either angry or vulnerable or hurt. So differentiating here between feelings and thoughts is at the heart of this guideline. Guideline 3 is titled Stating Wants and encourages us to say directly who you want to do something rather than leaving it vague. Specify concretely what you want the other person to do or say rather than what you want them to be or feel, and stressing what you do want rather than just what you don't want. Guideline 4 is titled Explaining the Purpose and deals with the explanation of why someone should change. So explaining the purpose of the criticism relies not on punishment or bribery, but on education based on the dialectical conception that the process of change begins primarily with internal commitment. Instead of trying to get someone to change through fear or obligation, the political purpose should be made clear so that the other party has the opportunity to understand that any criticisms are useful for the organization as a whole. Her working formula for these first 5 guidelines summarizes the process, but she also says not to use it too mechanically. But it goes, when you do A, observation, guideline 1, I feel B, emotion, guideline 2, and I want you to do C, action, want, guideline 3, because of D, purpose, guideline 4. Her next section deals with how to receive criticism. Guideline 5 is titled Paraphrasing. Paraphrasing someone's criticism would assure both parties that their criticism was getting through the way they intended it. So it would also give them a chance to correct any misinformation that might have occurred. But Lyons says to paraphrase only under the following conditions. When the other person asks me for assurance that I have understood her message, as when someone ends her statement by saying, do you know what I mean? When I'm unclear about what the other person had in mind and want to check my own understanding of it. And when things are starting to get rushed and confused and I want them to slow down. Guideline 6 is entitled Empathizing and addresses the goal of receiving criticism so that we can learn from it without counter-attacking defensively. Lyons says that by disciplining myself to empathize, I was able to stop my knee-jerk reaction, a defensive reaction. This counteracts a punitive dynamic. So when someone feels heard, they're less likely to escalate an attack, and they're more likely to listen in return. Guideline 7 is titled Preventing and Handling Defensiveness and argues that when a person responds defensively to criticism, she teaches others in her group that giving criticism is dangerous and pushes them back towards avoiding conflict. And so in order to mitigate the situation, Lyons suggests to empathize with whoever is feeling defensive and asking them what they want, perhaps even asking them to suggest ways to frame my criticism differently in order not to provoke defensive reaction next time. She also notes that a lot of defensiveness originates not in resistance to the content of the criticism, but rather the resistance to what the receiver hears as the intent behind the criticism. So when someone believes that a criticism is really a personal attack, demand, threat, or guilt trip, defensiveness comes to the fore. And so if I believe that a defensive reaction is likely, I can draw attention to it by prefacing my criticism with words that try to head the problem off. Instead of seeing struggle as bad, struggle should be understood as necessary to advance the movement and ideological thought. I use Line's approach here to consider conflicts within second wave feminist periodicals not as failures, but as evidence of a diverse, self-critical, and ever-evolving counterpublic that was enabled by and remained connected through a woman-controlled communications infrastructure. So another groundbreaking text, which approaches principled conflict between women from a different perspective, is Janice Raymond's A Passion for Friends. While the majority of the book engages with the history of female friendship, Raymond does not shy away from the problems that occur in female friendship and how to understand these for the advancement of women's transformative politics. Raymond borrows the term gyneffection to describe female friendship, a term first coined by Mary Dolly. Raymond's definition of gyneffection, which builds on Dolly's definition, is a woman-to-woman attraction, influence, and movement, female friendship, a loving relationship between two or more women, a freely chosen bond which, when chosen, involves certain reciprocal assurances based on honor, loyalty, and affection. In other words, the potential for female friendship lies in affecting, moving, stirring, and arousing each other to full power beyond the personal nature of these bonds and towards a fuller understanding of the social and political powers we embody through our female friendships. But it's no use to simply wish female friendships, or indeed sisterhood, without addressing the very real occurrences of conflict and disagreement. When for whatever reason these friendships disintegrate or splinter, the ensuing distress felt by feminists is tenfold that of the pain felt when we are betrayed by men. Feminists expect hetero relationships to go awry, both platonic, familial, and romantic. But the cracks and fissures within female friendships, and most pertinently between feminists, challenge our core beliefs and experiences of the sisterhood we all seek to envision. Groups split, sides are taken, communications are cut, and women retreat. While there's much to be said about the transformative potential of female friendships, feminists must not romanticize the subject by neglecting to confront the very real obstacles we face in relating to each other. Janice Raymond identifies three major obstacles standing in the way of female friendship. The first obstacle is the disassociation from the world through the following means. A, therapism. So while there are instances in which women justifiably seek help in a therapeutic setting, therapism here refers to the mechanistic model of self-disclosure, as if the self is an external object in need of repair. The result, as Raymond argues, is a therapeutic society where self-exposure ranks as one of the highest virtues. Women must show and tell all. Little about body or mind can be mysterious. Thus, women engage in massive psychological stripteases that fragment and exploit the inner life. Another aspect of disassociation from the world is relationism. This term identifies the reduction of friendship to the definition of woman as always being in reference to someone else. Both hetero relations as well as lesbian separatist relations risk adopting the profession of professional relating, in which the self is surrendered in favor of a relationship-centeredness. The final disassociation characteristic is the perversions of the personal as political. So this well-known feminist rallying cry crucially observed, of course, that the personal domain of a woman's life is not exempt from the public. In fact, it is a domain of political consequence. But Raymond observes that this idea has undergone reduction and misinterpretation to mean the personal is public knowledge. Such an interpretation then leads to the constant public disclosure of anything intimate, private, or personal. But as Raymond argues, privacy fosters involvement in the world because it adds a quality of reflection to life and to the selection of friends, what Alice Walker has called the rigors of discernment. The second major obstacle for female friendship is the assimilation to the world through the following means. A, sexual liberation. So the assimilation takes place here through the construction of the new woman who's liberated through male-directed sexual practices under the banner of neoliberalism. B, the tyranny of tolerance. the assertion that there should be no value judgments made about anything. Raymond says that using the rhetoric of not imposing values on others, women buy into a dangerous philosophy in which they strip themselves of the capacity for moral judgment. This results in a loss of feminist will, the will to shape history in a value-defined way. And C, the assimilation of silence. So the historical loving relationships between women is purposefully undermined and ignored, and this kind of silence erases the fact that women have been each other's best friends, supportive kin, devoted lovers, and constant companions. The potential for women's direct encounter with gynaffection is thus mediated and prevented by men's rendition of it. The third and final obstacle for female friendship is victimization in the world through the following means. A, mothers and daughters. What Raymond names victimism here refers to the victimization of the mother by a hetero-relational life, as well as the victimization of the daughter by mothers who pass on to daughters a tradition of disassociation from women. A lack of mother-daughter mentoring can persist through the passing on of survival tactics, which give women the capacity to suffer and to endure and or to manipulate their way safely and skillfully through the world that men have given them. But such survival skills engender guilt and neglect that threaten the possibility of gynaffection. B, the politics of guilt and guilt tripping. This can often lead to an uncritical acceptance of certain individuals and groups because they're members of an oppressed class. A pattern of women placating others by deprecating themselves emerges, in which women find it easier to bond with each other in misery out of a shared weakness of spirit and as victims. This concept has close bearings to contemporary identity politics used to invoke a kind of insider status. Feminists cannot be guilty or guilt tripped for creating the range of oppressive conditions under which many women live. And so we must instead act out of responsibility, not out of guilt. C, women's alienation from personal and political power. This is based on women's historical subjugation, and our learned behavior discourages us from taking or asserting our own power or potential. This breeds mistrust against any woman who is able to manifest individuality and directiveness, sometimes even outrightly berated by other women. Ambition and achievement can be frowned upon from within a non-competitive framework. And Raymond says that women's alienation from personal and political power endows the collective group or the community with false power. When a group devalues the possibility of women's direct personal and political power, the encouraged ethic becomes a false sense of group equality. The qualities that distinguish a woman are not called forth, and her distinctive power is rendered invisible. And then finally, D, woman as the ultimate victimizer of women. As Raymond points out, there have been real betrayals of women by other women, by women who supposedly shared a similar feminist spirit and vision, and by women whom one once called friends. Many women who join the feminist movement do not share a common world beyond the struggle, meaning that automatic sisterhood is not a given, and perhaps unrealistic expectations are at play in the betrayal we feel coming from women who have wronged us. Raymond describes how trashing and infighting occurred during the second wave, and because women were not prepared to confronting disloyalty from women, the conclusion was often that women are no better than men. This then easily leads to what Maridali calls a crisis of feminist faith, which leads women to believe that the illusion is feminism itself. So female alienation is produced when we're unable to foresee the horizontal animosity and hostility coming from other women themselves. When we're too wounded to be wounded again, it is enticing to surrender oneself to a nihilistic view about the movement, one which turns away from women in general. But as Raymond says, the best that women can make of this is to know precisely that this behavior will occur, face this knowledge head on, but perhaps more importantly, hard on, and act in a more gynaffective way because of and in spite of this knowledge of the mind and heart. Perhaps most pertinently, she reminds us that friendship is an ongoing process of repeated acts, a habit which reoccurs despite betrayals, ruptures, and disaffection from women. Rather than accepting the negation of the values of feminism and of female friendship in the face of rupture, Raymond urges us to confront the disillusionment and make up our own minds and hearts to once more choose women. Without sentimentalizing female friendships or placing categorical, uncritical trust in other feminists, the gifts of gynefiction are clear, even in the grip of failure. It has given us history in which we learn that women have always loved other women. It has given us an understanding that life of mere survival is insufficient for the spirit. It has given us that which is most seriously forbidden to us. So the fact that female friendship does not gift us with these characteristics forever, or that we often lose sisters to conflict along the way, does not nullify the possibility of it ever recurring. Raymond leaves us with the following conditions necessary for gyne-effective female friendship. The first is thoughtfulness. This is a necessary condition of female friendship. On the one hand, it includes the ability to reason, and on the other, consideration and empathy. The word thoughtfulness conveys the meaning of a thinking considerateness and a considerate thinking. The second condition is passion. A passionate friendship upholds the integrity between thought and passion, between self-development and collective progress. Friendship that is characterized by thoughtful passion ensures that a friend does not lose herself in the heightened awareness of and attachment to another woman. The third condition is worldliness. This refers not only to the creation of a feminist world on the boundaries of a man-made world, but the construction of the world as women imagine it to be. Set in the impossible constraints of patriarchy, our worldliness is dependent on our feminist vision, while our feminist vision is actualized in our worldly location. The fourth condition is happiness. While feminism is primarily a politics of risk and resistance, it must also hold out to women some promise of happiness. But Raymond here defines happiness as actually being life-glad. In this context, happiness refers to the striving for the full use of one's powers attained in fulfilling certain ends or purposes. In other words, a vision for a future of female friendship is not one based on any essence of natural female vitality or nurturing, but a vision grounded in the historical, cultural, and material bonds that women have created for ourselves in spite of the state of atrocity. Now let's take a look at an example of feminist conflict playing out and being mediated through woman-controlled publishing periodicals. We'll be looking specifically at the periodicals Sparerib, Trouble and Strife, Revolutionary Radical Feminist Newsletter, and Outright, all of which overlapped during the early mid-1980s in the UK, I should add as well, leading to the coverage of similar issues and disagreeing on similar concerns. The overarching controversy prevalent in all periodicals during this time was the Lebanon War of 1982 and how it influenced and affected politics between Palestine and Israel. The war began when the Israeli Defense Forces invaded southern Lebanon in order to target the Syrian production of surface-to-air missiles, as well as being a reaction to the bombing of northern Israel by the Palestinian Liberation Organization 1 year earlier. Feminists were invested in covering this political debate and the implications of the war because Palestinian, Lebanese, and Jewish women were all involved with the women's movement in the UK, and many had opposing views on how the war was being reported on. By July 1982, the Lebanese war was official and was covered as a center spread in the fourth issue of Outright, featuring several articles by Palestinian, Lebanese, and Israeli anti-Zionist women. I should add that this is not the correct cover of the fourth issue. Unfortunately, I can't access the archives at the moment for obvious reasons, but this will have to do. So the center spread included testimonials of Palestinian women who had been imprisoned and experienced violence by the Israeli government, in addition to a Jewish woman describing the Zionist views she was taught in school and that she decided to leave the country to avoid serving in the Israeli army. The subsequent page features two collectively written letters by Jewish women which adopt slightly opposing arguments. While one woman suggests that singling out Israel as the sole aggressor towards Palestine is an incomplete account and feeds into anti-Semitic biases, the second letter simply condemns the Israeli occupation. The issue over anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism became so contentious that Outright decided to publish a statement about their center-spread feature, which they say provoked threats of physical violence towards the collective. The statement clarifies that Outright is not a liberal paper. It is consciously biased towards women, Black, third world, and working class women, and towards the issues relevant to them, to their existence and struggles. Therefore, inasmuch as we will never publish any letter that tries to defend apartheid or suggest that it has an acceptable face, we have decided not to publish any Zionist or pro-Zionist letters. This editorial policy outraged some readers so much that the Outright Collective actually received bomb threats and individual threats and had been likened to the Nazis. The issue of Zionism spills over into Sparerib, perhaps the most well-known out of all the feminist periodicals in August 1982. Issue 121 features an interview in which the author Rosine Boyd interviews a Lebanese woman, a Palestinian woman, and an Israeli woman under the headline Women Speak Out Against Zionism. The Israeli woman Alicia Khan emphasizes that women must come out against Zionism because our sisters are being murdered, and that if a woman calls herself feminist, she should consciously call herself anti-Zionist. 2 months later, in October 1982, issue 123 features an article titled About Anti-Semitism, written by the London Jewish lesbian feminist group. The article is introduced by the Sparerib Collective, explaining that the Women Speak Out Against Zionism article, the previous article, generated a flood of letters and merited further discussion. The article responds to claims that unless we're anti-Zionist, we're not feminists, and contends instead that as Jewish feminists, the focus on Zionism seems to us in itself anti-Semitic and hardly feminist. The authors argue that the recent uptake in anti-Zionism has legitimized anti-Semitism and makes invisible the experience of Jewish women. Another 2 months later, in January 1983, the issue 126 of Sparerib addresses the contention in an editorial which attempts to suggest ways in which the diverging viewpoints can continue being discussed. We have a responsibility to decide how to present struggles and differences between women. In May 1983, issue 130 of Sparerib begins with another editorial referencing the controversies surrounding their stance on Israel and Palestine. The editorial describes the difficulties of trying to mediate the division. It says, the Sparerib Collective has been discussing the letters and the issues for months. We have considered various ideas and ways of publishing some of them. Our differences on how to react and to deal with letters which questioned our support of the Palestinian cause divided us then and divides us now, even though membership of the collective has changed by more than half during this time. So interesting that conflict or a disagreement can survive different memberships and different makeups of groups. The collective goes on to describe that they received around 40 letters in response to the article Women Speak Out Against Zionism from the previous year. Some members of Sparerib adamantly rejected publishing some of the letters that exhibited extreme Zionism, while other collective members wanted to publish letters that showed a wide array of opinions. The editorial explains that after numerous and exhausting discussions, we have decided not unanimously not to publish any of the letters we received. As a result of attempting to cover both distinct perspectives, the collective stated that they have been attacked from both sides, but that Sparerib still aims to be open to a continuous dialogue between Jewish women and Palestinian and Arab women. The same year, the revolutionary radical feminist Newsletter published an open letter by Judy Kayner in its 13th issue, which first appeared in the London Women's Liberation Newsletter. It references the refusal by Sparerib to publish the flood of letters by Jewish women as evidence of a growing anti-Semitic movement amongst feminists. She says, all the members of the London Jewish feminist group agreed that, regardless of their personal position on Zionism, the refusal to publish any of the letters received, many of which were from Jewish feminists, was anti-Semitic. The letter goes on to detail attempts made by the London Jewish feminist group to organize a meeting with Sparerib, which resulted in 2 formal meetings between the two groups after 6 months of total silence on Sparerib's part. Kayner also mentions the earlier articles published in Outright and criticizes the ways in which the term Jew and Zionist were used interchangeably. Kayner ends her open letter by urging women who write articles for Sparerib to demand that the publication include a statement saying the author artist protests against or does not condone Sparerib's silencing of Jewish women. The following month, June 1983, a year after the Lebanese War officially began, Sparerib finally decided to publish several dissenting letters from its readers. In response to what was surely an onslaught of diverging opinions, Sparerib published an article outlining the various differing views held on the collective itself, as the collective's differences of opinion were too great on this issue to try and maintain consensus, and eventually it led to a split within the collective. The article details the reasoning behind deciding not to publish the flood of letters and discusses censorship, racism, Zionism, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and what the implications of those politics are. One of the collective members' accounts ends by describing how Sparerib managed to navigate opposing politics. She says that Sparerib is the sort of magazine that can allow for those sorts of contradictions, that is the strength of the women's movement and of Sparerib. I hope that in light of us publishing letters from various positions in the last two issues and now writing ourselves, we can move out of what has felt to me like a deadlock. One reader, Leslie, addresses the split in the Sparerib collective, and while she cannot provide a solution, she writes that somehow I want to express to you that what you are doing and precisely the way you are doing it is a tribute to the women's liberation movement's integrity. It has brought the issues into our own homes for women who have perhaps only skirted around the edges of racism before. Another reader, Stella, attributes the level of discussion to the function of the letters pages themselves. She says, while with letters, all who have something to say, whether generally agreed with or not by the collective and readers, can air their views and be heard, unlike in a public meeting where some women have louder voices or are more articulate than others. Letters also make public the strength of feeling of opposing viewpoints, which I think we all need to know to even begin to fight what we feel is undesirable in the women's movement. A third reader, Jane, identifies a major problem as being that Sparerib posits itself as representing the women's movement in its entirety. Jane writes that please stop feeling you as a collective can or should solve all the attendant problems of definition just because you run a magazine. Your problems are our problems. And maybe it would help if you were a bit less purist, a bit more materialist, and had less sense of carrying the can for the movement. 1 year later, in 1984, the newly founded periodical Trouble and Strife was challenged by its readers in a letter published in their 4th issue. Romy Bowen and Bernadette Manning, two women who had attended this Trouble and Strife readers meeting earlier that year, criticized the collective for not taking seriously the issue of anti-Semitism during this meeting. A lengthy reply from the collective was published following directly after the critical letter, which was largely apologetic and notably mentioned the controversy which Outright and Sparerib experienced. We accept that we should have been aware of these implications and the dangers of setting one woman against another, especially given the history of Sparerib and Outright in the past 2 years. Taking a look now at the visualization of how this particular conflict played out, it's clear how communication through printed circulation of the periodical enabled a webbed network of debate. Crucially, however, the utopic and aspirational goals of encouraging conflict and difference is what enabled the maintenance of the printed network infrastructure. The distributed nature of how conflict plays out within print culture promised a kind of feminist future through its networked structure that continues beyond the publication's life itself, as many of these debates are still ongoing today. Understanding the significance of having a woman-controlled communications infrastructure means that the possibilities for transformative conflict are determined by us, not the corporate platforms which tend to be designed specifically to exacerbate, not resolve, principled conflict. Having now looked at the issues of feminist conflict, feminist friendships, and a real-world example of how conflict over the issues of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism have played out within the pages of the feminist periodical, let's now unpack this by thinking about what the periodical document specifically offered second-wave feminists in hashing out their differences. senior humanities lecturers from Northumbria University, Victoria Bazan and Melanie Waters, have written extensively about the feminist periodical document. They say that as mediating objects and sites of activism, periodicals can tell stories about feminist histories, but they can also problematize those stories, refusing to plug historical gaps and resisting the production of a singular and unified history of feminism. Not only can the examples of disagreement in feminist periodicals offer us strategies for struggling through differences today, they also help unravel the nuances and diversity of viewpoints within the second wave feminist movement and dissuade us from understanding the women's liberation movement as one monolithic entity. They argue that there are signal images, such as the live protest of the 1970s Miss World contest in London, which sort of linger in the public consciousness as feminist victories, but they also necessarily distort that, which was a messy and dynamic political movement, by isolating and generalizing a feminist historical timeline. They say that feminist periodicals are sites of mediation that offer counter narratives to this dominant image of feminism and its histories. These counter narratives are in dialogue with public sphere debates and indeed are partly shaped by those debates. At the same time, they interrupt the transmission of feminism itself as a singular, unified social movement. Such micro-level historical approaches reveal a proliferation of feminist experiences that destabilize the notion of a singular feminist history and ultimately undermine a unitary feminist identity. Specifically addressing the splits in feminist history, they say that as periodicals give voice to conflicts within feminism, they also demonstrate that these conflicts, though effectively charged, are by no means fatal. Indeed, these movements' histories are dominated by accounts of the political and emotional fallout from the internal division. For instance, the history of the suffrage movement revolves about the split between the so-called Puts and Panks, those who embraced militancy and those who rejected it. Memories of the women's liberation movement frequently focus on the split between socialist feminism and radical feminists, which came to a head at the last women's liberation movement conference held in Birmingham in 1978. And so feminist periodical culture points to the ongoing everyday activism of women throughout the 20th century. Feminist activism does not disappear. It simply changes, adapts, and responds to the political exigencies of its particular historical moment. The feminist magazine, we suggest, is both a material artifact that resonates with conflict and a metaphor for feminism itself. It is a cacophony of dissonant voices that, in spite of that dissonance, generates contingent feminist identities capable of collective action. In reference to women's everyday, unglamorous, and under-researched activism of the 1970s and 1980s, Bazin and Waters argue that tracing the history of feminism through feminist periodicals is one way of serving the interests of those women actively involved in organizing and campaigning for social and political change. It is one way of resisting accounts of history that are overarching and teleological, that stress key moments and individual actions, rather than the ongoing everyday and collective nature of activism. The magazine highlights the micro-histories of feminism, the traces of a history of grassroots activism that develops out of collective, often conflicted, and multiple feminist identities. So briefly now, the author of In Love and Struggle, Margareta Jolly, describes the conflict and disagreement in feminist letter writing as velvet boxing gloves. And she says that although they often intend to punch, these fists have soft palms inside softer gloves, their epistolary framing signaling a continued longing for feminist love. And so, while conflicts covertly express desires, a rhetoric of love decorates polemic. However, Jolly notes that political negotiation in feminist open letter writing is a balancing act. She says that wearingly demanding, it can drive the self into a defensive affirmation of identity rather than the connection to which it ostensibly appeals. What strikes me as a crucial prerequisite for these exchanges of differences through letters to have been able to take place in the first place is the sheer multiplicity of viewpoints, periodicals, and various editorial strategies that enabled a feminist publishing ecosystem of sorts for the discussion and development of feminist disagreement to take place. Susan Hawthorne, who's the co-founder of Spinifex Press, wrote a manifesto for independent publishing, and central to her argument is the term bibliodiversity, which was originally coined by Chilean publishers in the 1990s. And she stresses the importance of diversity and says, bibliodiversity is a complex, self-sustaining system of storytelling, writing, publishing, and other kinds of production of literature and literature. The writers and producers are comparable to the inhabitants of an ecosystem. Bibliodiversity contributes to a thriving life of culture and a healthy eco-social system. Just as an ecosystem is biodiverse when it has dynamic balance, that is, when one species is not overrunning and dominating others to their exclusion, so too an eco-social system is only in dynamic balance when a host of varied voices can be heard. If the social habitat is overrun by epistemological monocultures, single voices all saying the same thing, single voices all saying the same thing, there's a loss of dynamic balance, and those who have something new or different to say will be ignored. And so for a brief moment in women's history, a feminist communications infrastructure enabled this multiplicity of viewpoints to take place. When feminists were faced with the male-dominated international publishing industry in the 1970s and 1980s, similar challenges confronted them. The result was a coming together of publishers, booksellers, and writers to share skills and engage in networking, which in turn created opportunities for co-publishing. However, towards the 1990s, an upsurge in postmodern theory tore at the radical heart of mass social movements, as well as the takeover by Amazon.com and big box booksellers. As centers for feminist ideas disappeared, the rise in a libertarian ideology of individual consumerist choice came into prominence. Instead of centers of activism, many feminists were directed to put their energies into non-governmental organizations, NGOs, which were dependent on funding from governments or corporations and therefore were often too compromised in their objectives. And so to conclude briefly, it's worth thinking about how communication structures can enable better disagreements between feminists, and thinking about female friendships, which promises a revolution amongst feminists, but it also ignores the very real betrayal, heartbreak, and conflict between feminists and women. Any woman who has been active in the women's movement will recognize that sisterhood is not effortless. The expectations we place on our own female friendships, particularly amongst feminists, can result in painful consequences and rifts within the movement. But as Sarah Schulman argues in Conflict is Not Abuse, conflict, after all, is rooted in difference, and people are and always will be different. We, individuals, couples, cliques, families, communities, nations, peoples, often pretend, believe, or claim that conflict is instead abuse and therefore deserves punishment. This overstatement of harm is often expressed in shunning, a literal refusal to speak in person with another human being or group of people, an exclusion of their information, the act of obstruction to a person being heard, and the pretense that they do not exist. Instead, Schulman argues that emphasizing communication and repair instead of shunning and separation is the key to transforming these paradigms. And it is precisely communication which the periodical document offered second-wave feminists in mediating conflict. Periodicals, as a form of print activism, militate against the homogenizing logic of the final word by creating multimodal spaces that can accommodate the voices of different and dissenting women. So instead of romanticizing or condemning an abstract caricature of the second-wave feminist movement, it is crucial to recognize how instances of conflict and disagreement propelled forward the development of more radical and plural theories. In fact, in some instances, periodicals demonstrate how collective actions arise as direct consequences of struggles and disagreements within the movement, how so-called negative feelings can inspire and propel political mobilizations. The histories of feminism's failures might be reinterpreted as histories of interruption. Shallow sentimentalism about female friendship is both unrealistic if we are to mobilize women from all walks of life, as well as being the condition for disappointment. As Janice Raymond says, to ground gynaffection in a natural capability of women to bond with each other is a false optimism that will betray itself. To appreciate the obstacles we face in cultivating gyneffection is to recognize the profound transformative and political strength of female friendship with scrutiny and discipline. Perhaps this is the way forward in embodying strength across difference, while thinking specifically about the ways in which a feminist ecosystem of varying communication infrastructures can allow for multiplicity and the process of internal struggles become a transformative rather than a destructive tool. And with that, I will now move to the discussion part of the presentation and stop recording.